Welcome to Retro Groove. Enjoy your voyage.
Welcome to Retro Groove. I'm Adam.
And I'm Liam.
And this is a podcast where we talk about music that stands the test of time. Welcome to episode 2 of our second season. And today we have kind of an experiment. We're experimenting a little bit with a wider purview, if you want to call it that. Liam and I were talking and thought it was finally time to delve into the wonderful world of progressive rock.
Yeah, we're going to get progressive with the podcast.
Yeah, we're going progressive. This is a broad topic. We've got a lot to talk about. There's a lot to cover here. And just right out front here, I'll just put it out there as a caveat that there's no way that we're going to be able to talk about every artist that deserves to be talked about. No. It's just not possible. But we're going to do as much as we can. We're going to hit as many corners of this incredible, sometimes misunderstood genre of music, sometimes hard to define genre, but
yeah.
Musical subgenres are always very fluid and, there's no hard lines anywhere with these, you want to call it rock. Okay. It's definitely rock, but like what subgenre and then what, branching splinter of that subgenre is this particular band. And it's like, it gets really, you're splitting hairs at that point.
Yeah. And it's also definitely like sort of out of my wheelhouse a bit. I mean, I have I think all of us have had some sort of engagement with the subgenre or some songs and artists within it, but it's not something that I was ever heavily into growing up. I've come to appreciate a bunch of it now as I'm older, which I think is kind of a natural thing to do with music like this, but
being a dad helps.
Yeah. And I think just like having broader perspective and like not being hung up on a love song so much. And so I can hear lyrics and themes about other things because I'm not just yearning. So like, yeah, I think like it's a cool thing to delve into now because I think I'm at a better place where I can be more receptive to it. So I'm almost kind of learning a bunch of stuff as we go here. So that's cool.
Yeah, well, there's a lot to learn for sure.
Yeah. But what's cooking with you?
Nothing too much. Just trying to just soak every last bit of fun out of this summer. Summer is kind of drawing to a close very quickly here. School will be starting up very soon here within the next week. Yeah. It's different here than what I remember it being on the East Coast.
Yeah.
Back east, it's usually not until like after Labor Day.
Yeah, we're waiting until Labor Day for sure.
Yeah, so they're going back this coming week. And it's, out had a nice birthday party with my oldest out at the pool. And I was just, looking around at the water and the sunshine and, kicking back and enjoying some drinks. And just like, man, this summer is almost over. And I'm a big, my birthday's in the summer. I'm a big summer vibes kind of guy. We did our beach trip and everything. And, there's a little bit of, there was a tinge of melancholy for me with it being like, oh, this is probably like the last big, summertime hurrah for this year. But, everything is cyclical, and all good things must come to an end. And
Yeah.
fall is coming. They've already got the Halloween stuff at a lot of the
Oh,
popular
jeez.
retailers. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. My daughter wanted to go to Bath and Body Works, and they had all of the Halloween and fall themed candles and everything out. And I was like, oh man, here we go. Before you know it,
Pumpkin
everything is
spice.
going to be pumpkin spice, and which I don't mind, but it's not my favorite thing.
Sure.
Halloween's fun, but yeah, I'm not a huge like fall person myself. I'm a summertime person, and I love winter. I love Christmas. So it's but like fall, I'm like, it's fine. It
Yeah.
gets us closer to the holidays, so I'm cool with that part of it. But you can leave the pumpkin spice where it is.
For
What
sure.
about you?
I'm doing the same. I'm hitting the beach a bunch. I have been trying to get into a routine whenever I have the time in the morning. Just grab a coffee and something and go down to the beach and
Yeah.
read or vibe or whatever. And I had this moment the other day. I've got this like book that I've been reading. Just kind of like really good perspective book, like being present, just trying to like work through mental stuff. And I'm down at the beach and I'm like vibing. And
Hmm.
there's a series of condos like over the fence from the beach that I go to. And there's one that's got this like outdoor space and it's got these like drapes and stuff across it. And
Hmm.
sometimes music wafts out from that one, and those people are living their best life, man. I mean, I'm
Oh, for
happy
sure.
for them. They are living right there on the water. And I'm sitting there and I'm trying to read, and it's like Celine Dion day. And at first I'm like, God, can you just like stop playing music? And then I'm like, God, can you just stop playing Celine Dion? And by the fifth song, I'm like, Celine Dion's got hits. Like, like I came full around and I put my book down and I'm like, all right, I'll look at the water and I'll listen to Celine Dion.
Why
That's
not?
not so bad. Like
Could be
it's all
worse.
coming back to me now. Like it's just so good. Yeah. So yeah, I'm like same thing. Just good summer vibes and
Hmm.
an artist that I don't usually associate with that. But it worked.
Yeah.
Like somebody played DJ for me and I went for the ride. So
There you go.
heck yeah.
Take it where you can get it. It's
Yeah,
it's
man.
good. I've been listening to a lot of different prog rock that I had never really delved into before.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if you've been doing that in preparation for the episode, but like I don't know that I've ever really just sat down and listened to like Emerson, Lake and Palmer,
Yeah.
like stuff like that. I'm a fan of the genre, but I really did a deep dive into a lot of these albums that I recognize the name, I'd recognize the album cover, but probably never really listened to other than in passing here and there. So been doing a lot of that, and I'm excited to dig into it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
Um,
I again, like I didn't spend a ton of time listening to it back in the day. I'm not sure if you can kind of track your exposure points or whatever, but thinking about it leading up to this, I mean, I remember my dad loved Yes. He
mhm.
had like a 4 CD box set of Yes that I just thought was the lamest thing ever, and I didn't want anything to do with it. My mom was very into the Moody Blues, which
Yep.
is like on that 60s tip of that orchestral, really like intricate arrangement
Mhm.
uh, coming into this prog space. And then she kind of bookended. She liked like the Beach Boys, Moody Blues, like that late '60s, and then she liked Supertramp, like
There you
that
go.
like pop,
Nice.
but like them post prog, like into their more Breakfast in America like where they found their kind of pop sensibility.
Yeah.
So it was interesting. Like as I looked at it, like I was exposed to all these different points of it, but I never like it was never a thing that was just played around the house. We're not that cerebral of a family. I think my dad's a guitarist, so I think he just appreciated sort of the like skill and intricacy of
Oh, for
some of
sure.
the prog stuff. I know he likes ELP, but I can't say that I ever like listened to it a bunch.
Right.
The one thing that I definitely remember though is I had this friend that I got chummy with in high school, and he and I would have this back and forth. I was like really getting into Metallica at the time,
Hmm.
and I just thought that they were the coolest, most badass dudes, and he was so into Dream Theater. Like that's all he could talk about when we talked about music was just
Oh man.
everything, and it just made me hate them so much. He created this point of contention of just like how enlightened Dream Theater is and how they are the best like
Oh,
hard rock prog metal band or whatever you want to call them, and I would just be like, well, this is stupid, so
can
I'm
we
not going to listen to it.
do-
Just not going to hear it, you know.
yes, an
And I
overzealous.
haven't gone to it. Yeah, like
Yeah,
I've never really spent time listening to them. I've heard songs; they're really good, but it just, yeah,
a
I don't know,
zealot
man.
can certainly ruin a good thing.
Oh, for sure, yeah. But do you have a gauge on how you were exposed to this kind of
I mean,
music?
kind of similar. We're roughly the same age anyway,
Mhm.
so yeah, it's so funny because like yeah, my dad had Yes records and my mom had Moody Blues records. You know what I mean? That's
Amazing,
dad's love Yes and
yeah.
mom's love Moody Blues.
Knights in White Satin, yeah.
There you go. And I think it was also more so uh my aunt who lived near us and was almost like a second mother to me. I spent a lot of time over there. She was like my mom liked the Moody Blues and had one or two of her records. My aunt was obsessed with Moody Blues.
Oh, okay.
So you know, she was a little bit more you know, retained a lot of this was the early 80s for those that don't know. And um she retained a lot more of that the flower child
Mm-hmm.
part of herself. You know what I mean? My mom just kind of, you know, had kids and
Grew
got
up,
into that mode. Yeah, grew
yeah.
up a little bit, you know what I mean? But yeah, my I don't know for whatever reason, you know, they never had kids, so that was a little bit more of a reason why, you know, her first, you know, nephew you know, I got a lot of attention from her and but she never had kids. So she was very you know, pie in the sky, utopian. Like I have this one amazing memory of her where, you know, I was playing with my GI Joe figures at her house
Mm-hmm.
and like, you know, obviously had like a tank or one of their vehicles and they were all like killing each other. And, you know, she walked in the room where I was playing on like the shag carpet or whatever. And she was like, no, no, see, look, we can play like this. And she like took the guns out of their hands and sat them down and was like, now see, they're all in church. And
Oh my gosh, that's amazing.
she was very, yeah, it
Wow.
was a great memory. But that was just her personality. And so
Yeah.
very, you know, peace and love and, you know, everything can be beautiful and is beautiful if you put the right perspective on it. So she opened my eyes to a lot of that kind of, music that would just, to me, it was just kind of background noise while I was over there at my aunt and uncle's house, but
Mm-hmm.
that ended up becoming somewhat of a soundtrack to a good portion of my childhood. So, you know, there are still kind of vignettes and portions of songs that pop into my head that I couldn't point out what album they're from, or even if it's necessarily the Moody Blues or who it is, but you know, I know it's of that ilk. And so that was kind of ingrained in me at a very early age.
Mm-hmm.
And then my dad had a lot of the more pop leaning progressive stuff and you know Boston stuff like that, kind of
Oh yeah.
arguable.
Yeah,
But Electric Light Orchestra, of
for
course.
sure.
So he had a lot of that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, him and like my godfather were uh trumpet players, so they had a lot of like the Chicago Chuck Mangione, and of course that's kind of leaning a little bit jazz, but
That's in there though.
yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
What was the other one? Chase, stuff like that. And so that was all, you know, played around the house and on the record player. And when I discovered music and would be like, my parents had moved on to tapes, so I would go through the records and be like, cool, these are mine now. And I was
Same.
really just getting into a lot of that stuff. So there was definitely some influence there on, both sides that I can
Cool.
point back to as some early, you know, the roots of my interest in the progressive side of rock music.
Yeah.
For
Do
better
you
or
feel
worse.
like the aunt and uncle side of things, where you said like they kind of held on to that Moonchild, peace and love,
Yeah, a little
like
bit. Hmm.
because when we're talking about Moody Blues, and we should talk Beatles and Beach
Yeah.
Boys,
Oh
like
yeah, she
that.
loved the Beach Boys.
Yeah, I was gonna like that era. There is kind of the crossroads where you go from to either psych or prog, I think, which is
Yeah.
something to dig into. But do you get the feeling that they were more in that like psych open-minded space, or more so in that like proggy, like listen to the instrumentalism, listen to like the horn doing this thing, listen to this like touch point or sample or something, like I feel like it's probably more in that psych space, right? Like that kind of openness, that open expressiveness, maybe.
Probably. I mean,
Yeah.
so like one of my most prized physical, material possessions is her copy of Harvest by Neil Young,
Yeah.
with, her name on it and everything.
Cool.
So it was definitely more the folk slash
Yeah.
like early psych side of things.
Hmm.
That was definitely more what she was listening to.
Cool.
My uncle hated music, so whatever. Like,
Okay. Yeah.
we don't like
Not in
him
the
anyway.
conversation. Yeah.
um,
But yeah, I
but
mean, that's interesting. Like you see the psych and the folk kind of get mixed up, and that's not what we're going to be talking about today, right? Like that is the way that a
right,
lot of things went. Like when you look at Fleetwood Mac or anything like that, like
for
Grateful
sure, for
Dead,
sure.
all that stuff. You had a few bands that rode the line in different spaces, but you did have kind of psych and folk go off with, Crosby, Stills, like they all
Sure.
just went off and did their
Yep.
stuff, and then you had this this intricacy that
Yeah.
kind of stemmed from it all. But we're pulling it back to Sergeant Pepper. We're pulling
Yes.
it back to Pet Sounds, right?
Hmm.
We're pulling it back to when you had the pop sensibility, and this like consumerism that flared up around digestible pop songs.
Hmm.
And then you have those same artists who are household names for digestible pop songs who want to do something different. They're getting
Right.
exposed to jazz, they're getting exposed to world music, they're hearing things all over the place, and they want to do something that's not just write a catchy song about a girl,
Exactly. Yeah.
and so they look to build something bigger, and we get these albums that are game changers and
Yes,
go on to influence all the others, right?
absolutely. And like, you hear Paul McCartney talk about it, they got bored of the formula,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? Playing as often as they played all over the world and writing songs and recording albums. And it's just like after a while, uh, particularly as relatively simple as that work was, as good as
Mhm.
it was just simple. Uh, Teenagers could learn it and play it. Um, you get bored after a while,
Yeah.
and with them traveling all over the world, with the influence of Eastern philosophy a little bit
Hmm.
in there, them wanting to kind of experiment and experimenting with the more orchestral side of things. they wanted to start recording this way and writing songs with these new ideas. And you can't, I think there is something to say about, okay, obviously they were experimenting with some psychotropic drugs,
Yeah,
and
lots.
that you can't talk about it without at least mentioning that probably had to have somewhat of a hand in their desire to just kind of expand things out
Right.
beyond, the immediacy of what
Yeah.
they were initially doing.
Yeah.
So, but neither here nor there, with or without that, they wanted to branch out and experiment and try new things. And the other side of that is the technical side, or
Hmm.
the technological side, I should say, where um, recording this kind of music going into um, Pet Sounds and beyond, and Sergeant Pepper's and beyond, you know, there was a time not too long before this where you would literally set up two or three microphones in a room and, okay, go, and that
You
was
better
it.
get it.
Whatever was,
Yep.
you know what I mean? There was no overdubs, multi-tracking, anything like that.
Mhm.
What was played in that immediate, whatever, however long the song is, that's what the song was, and that's it. But as the technology advanced and you had things like, multi-tracking, don't want to get too technical, but being able to record something and then take that recorded piece of music and then go back and play something else over it, or intersect multiple recorded pieces of music together, that technology was becoming available. And
Yeah.
so it's almost like the technology allowed this new form of music to happen.
Yeah.
Because it honestly, a lot of what you hear on those, particularly as you get into the 70s, that wouldn't have even technically been possible. It just wouldn't. Not
Right.
without just some kind of crazy setup with a bunch of different microphones and, a rotating stage of musicians. It just wouldn't really be feasible or possible.
Yeah,
Um,
and you look at the culture of the moment and the sort of
yeah.
trajectory of like liberation, free thought, experimentation. It was
Hmm.
pervasive at the time. And so you have this like soil, you have this like
Yeah.
garden that's ready for it. You have the tools of the technology that you're talking about. You have the Mellotron, you have these
Yeah.
synthesizers that are running tapes, and you can do sampling in real time and you can perform that live.
Yep.
And then you have the intentionality then that comes along to go in these different directions. The Beatles choosing to make a Sergeant Pepper kind of opens the door then for other people, other musicians to say, oh, well, if they can do that, if the Beatles that I know can be this, then what can I be? What
Right.
I can go do something else. I can take my skills at the bassoon and
Right.
do a
Yeah.
thing, like. And if you have bassoon on your album in the 70s, you're a prog rock band. That's how you know.
There
Yeah.
you go.
Yeah.
Exactly right.
Um,
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, so we talked a little bit about like psych and
Yeah.
prog and where they stand. I mean, I think, do we want to, it's hard to define. Do we want to kind of talk about what we think defines what prog rock was? Because prog rock has become at times a dirty word. It's not
Yeah.
what the artists ultimately want to be identified
Right.
as, which happens every so often in music when something gets typified. I mean, alternative music has been the alternate for decades now. Is it still an alternate? Is it still
Right.
indie? Is it still emo? I don't know.
Right. Right.
So prog, like, to you, is there something that defines what prog rock is?
I mean, it's funny. So we put the question out on the Discord and on Twitter, like, what's your favorite prog rock group and why? And Dan, innocently and can't blame him, asked, well, can we define prog rock?
Mm,
And my half joking response was, the only person that can define prog rock for you is yourself.
Yeah, that's
So,
amazing.
I mean,
Yeah,
so, but like, okay, it's progressive rock. It's
yeah,
taking the rock music formula and moving it beyond the four walls of the, four on the floor, 1 2 3 4, 1 2 3 4 timing, and
right.
the same time signature throughout the whole song, and talking about a pretty girl that you wanted and had and then lost, you know what I mean? Going
Mhm.
beyond that narratively and going beyond what would be normally expected sonically, and moving into something bigger, grander, you know, also with instruments like you mentioned, bringing other instruments into the group, um, to create a different kind of sound, and just doing something different, moving something into a more, trying not to use the word progressive, but a more open-minded space,
Mhm.
maybe,
Yeah.
where anything is possible. You can tell larger stories. You can have the entire B side of your album be just a 19-minute song. You can
Yeah.
do that.
And they
Why
did.
not? They did. It's not a bad song either. So, I mean, you
Yeah.
saw Pink Floyd do it. Yes, did it. I mean, um, and again, that also comes down to the technological advancements. You couldn't probably have a 19-minute song a decade earlier.
Yeah.
So it was just a perfect storm with the technological, the political climate, the the desire for something bigger, something more. Um, I think that also defines it as a very, um, if not a specific sound, then at least a specific vision. And that
Yeah.
vision is just like bringing rock music into something more than people initially thought it could be.
I think that's what it needs to be or needed to be. I think um, the flexibility of it could and would lend itself best to the format or the subgenre.
Mhm.
I think that part of the problem, and we make a habit of making sure that we're not gatekeeping, that we're not judging, that we're
Right.
we're open to everybody's understanding and interpretation because that's the nature of art. But that inclination to define things kind of does wind up being counterproductive to
Yeah, it's
this format
restrictive.
in general, because when you look at Pink Floyd, they don't tick the boxes. Like they do have the
Right.
vision, they have the experimentation, they have this uh the a story to tell, or a purpose to their music, but you don't have a lot of time change shifts. You don't have the
Right.
virtuosity of these elaborate, key guitar parts, whatnot. Like there's sampling, there's really well orchestrated music as far as like how they're piecing it together. They have something they want to say, and it's very different.
Mhm.
But I also think that it's the reason that you joked earlier, like it's the reason, it's off mic, but you joked that some albums come when you buy a turntable. And I
Yeah.
think Dark Side,
Yeah.
Dark Side of the Moon is that, right? We talked about that
Right.
on one of our previous episodes. It's one of the greatest selling albums of all time.
Yes.
Um, you're not going to see that with just any quote unquote prog album, because there's something else there to it, and it doesn't have the pretension that I think certain artists that we'll delve into wind up having.
Yeah.
Um, the nature of feeling like you are in on the vision, right?
Yeah.
You're hearing something in the music that is being intended. um there's a feeling of exclusivity, like you're seeing
Mhm.
things that others aren't. And it starts to work against some of these other artists, whereas when you look at the psych space, it's really about the experience and not as much. It's kind of like what you are feeling to the music as opposed to what you're learning or
Mm.
taking away from what you're hearing. I guess it sounds almost the same. But the easiest way that I've kind of defined it to myself is I see psych as having more focus on that improvisation, right? It's like
Hmm.
the playing is still very intricate and very technical and very impressive, but it can shift. It kind of goes with the feeling, which does have at least certain jazz standards to it. But Prog is calculated. Prog has its careful composition.
Yeah.
It there's not a whole lot of room for changing what you're doing while in the moment on stage, because there's a reason why you wrote the song, that you wrote the
Right.
notes the way that you did.
Certainly less improvisational in nature, and there's a reason why it gave birth to more modern subgenres like math rock,
Hmm.
where you can't really improvise because it's so exact and precise.
Yeah.
So that makes sense. That's a good um little divider there,
Yeah.
where the psych and prog rock might be two sides of the same coin, but you know and there may be some crossover there, but I think that pretty much puts at least somewhat of a cap on it, to where we can say, okay, Pink Floyd. It's funny too, and as I'm saying this, I'm remembering, like, in some of my discovery phase of, okay, what are some prog rock groups that I haven't really listened to, or that I might not even really be aware of. So I was driving, and I just go, I flipped on the button to pull up Siri,
Mm.
and I said play prog rock radio, and the first song that came up was off of Dark Side of the Moon.
Oh, wow.
It just started playing some Pink Floyd, which of
Yeah.
course it's like, it's Apple Music, you know what I mean? They're not
Yeah.
gonna know what's real prog rock, but it's just indicative of, I think, what a lot of people think it is.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
it all flies in the face, or like two sides of the coin is a good way to put it.
mhm,
It all tends to fly in the face, more so the prog space of the sort of blues core,
mhm,
the almost like American core of a lot of rock music. You see a lot of that, because Led Zeppelin's another one where there's a lot of progressive things that are going on there, but
mhm.
there's a blues backbone to that
Yeah,
band. There's a
they
blues
don't delve
backbone
very
to the
far from it.
Stones. Exactly. Like, and blues, again, some of those bands will go on to have a greater scope and a story, and they can use the blues structure to build their rock opus. But for the most part, the basis of the blues is heartache, unrequited
Yeah.
love.
Yep.
It's just getting out those sad songs or those love songs. So Prague is more Euro. Prague is more
A little bit.
grounded
Yeah.
in classical.
Hmm.
It's
Hmm.
less lyrical. It's more about the expression, the concept, the social commentary.
Hmm.
I mean, we'll get into a bunch of these, but like Genesis for me, um, I've come to love Peter Gabriel. It from his 80s pop success into the 90s, but then going back to his early
Yeah. If you
albums
go
with
back.
Genesis, and you can kind of see
Hmm.
where everything came from. Um, I, Genesis is one of those perfect things. It's just like, that was just going to be, he's just making art. He's just looking for
Right.
some kind of, he just had stuff he wanted to get out, and he was working it out on stage with these guys.
There you go.
And when it didn't work for him anymore, he left. They had brought this, regular guy who wasn't an art school student like the other guys were, like he just, Phil Collins comes in, he's a drummer. He's just a good drummer. And he takes the helm of the band and takes them on into the 80s and
There you
transforms it
go.
into something else. But Peter Gabriel's era of Genesis is probably like, again, as I'm older now and starting to find this stuff, those first few albums that he's on, I'm having a great time Like it
Yeah.
feels it like I feel like I just want to listen to Foxtrot like on repeat and get an idea of like what he's talking about. I feel like it's so rich. There's so much there. He's got a lot that he's trying to get across.
Yes,
And that's kind of exciting, you know? Like
it is.
I love a good 3-minute love song, but like an 8-minute like calculated piece it gives me something to dig into.
Yeah. Yeah. There's so a 3-minute love song can tell you a story that, you could probably identify with or
Mhm.
point to certain things in your life that remind you about it. But, an 8 to 10 minute prog rock movement could paint an entire picture of a life start to finish and the village where this took place on the planet that we've never heard of before.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
it's all sonic in nature.
Yeah.
Like it's painting these pictures with instruments and not even necessarily so much uh lyrically, which some bands do and some bands don't.
Yeah.
There's certainly more instrumental prog rock groups and some that have plenty of vocals. So I think we've defined it
Mhm.
maybe as well as you kind of can.
Yeah.
You could go more restrictive with it, but I don't think there's any reason to. And then you just start to, at that point, you're splitting hairs.
Yeah. And then
So,
so off mic you made another comment, another joke
mhm.
about in the court of the Crimson King, which
Yes,
at most people point to, I think, is like the genre defining catalyst, like one of the core
yeah,
uh
it's one of them for sure.
pillars of what this format is. And you had joked that that's another one that comes with a turntable when you buy it. And
Yeah,
I would counter that it's one that someone often inherits from an uncle or
there you
a
go.
father or someone. I feel like it is one of the most handed down, passed along. It's just got this cultish connection to it where it's just like, oh my God, you got to hear this. I
Right.
feel like at any time I've inherited a record collection, I mean, like, not every time, but 9 times out of 10, it's got this album in it.
Yeah,
Like
for
everybody
sure.
just had this album because I think it was such a dramatic shift. It was just like something that nobody had ever heard before.
Right.
Um, but I hadn't spent too much time with it, honestly. Like it sat on my shelves and I listened
Hmm.
to it once or twice. But again, like I feel like it's something that requires you to sit and ingest
Yes.
and
It's
ruminate
not
on.
passive listening music for
Right.
sure.
Right. And I'm always like, I don't have time for this. Like, give me
It's like
something
reading a
else.
book. It literally is like you can't passively read a book while you're washing dishes or
Yeah.
like, you know what I mean? Like, I mean, it, yeah, you can listen to books on tape, but even that is a little bit more of a, wow, I just aged myself really bad. Books on tape.
Hmm.
Uh,
I had them.
but like it's more of a, um, it's an active experience, right? You could put it on in the background, but it's not good background music because
No.
there's so much change going on. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Background music is something good and steady and something predictable, and I think that's one thing that can also define prog rock. It's definitely not that. It's constantly changing and it's not predictable. Um even Yes songs that I've heard dozens of times, if I try to like, predict what the next part is coming up and I'm like, whatever, tapping my hands to the drums on the keyboard and or on the on the steering wheel or wherever I'm at, I can't always even predict it because it's they know what they're doing, but it's so mathematically precise and musically precise that I'm like, I'm lost. It's like, but it's in that's what makes it interesting. That's at least part of what makes it interesting.
Yeah.
So you talk about Court of the Crimson King and a lot of these you know, groups like Jethro Tull. Without Brian Wilson and the Beatles, you don't have the foundation there with almost like the permission. You know what I mean? They kind of broke the glass ceiling of experimentation, so to speak.
Hmm.
And you know, of course, there were others. We're generalizing, um, but without that, you don't really have the okay, like they're experimenting and doing some wild things with instruments that we've never seen used before on a pop record. And not only that, that would be enough, but these are the most popular records in the world at this point.
Yeah.
So it's almost like, okay, there's a market for this. Not that whether or not there's a market for it means that it's important or not, but the fact that it's marketable speaks to its appeal, and it speaks to you know, its viability as an art form. So that definitely gave way to those early groups, um, to take, you know, that torch and run with it, and run they did,
Yeah.
because then it was, shoot, once the 70s hit, it was everywhere. It
I
was,
mean,
and that there's a reason why there were millions and tens of millions of these records sold.
yeah, it was prolific too. I mean, that's the other thing that shocks me about all of this is when you pull out a band like Yes, the
Hmm.
scope of what they're trying to do is so impressive that you'd think, all right, well, and granted, we're coming from the age where there's a 2 to 3 year album cycle for most artists, although
Right.
that's starting to change again. But for a while, just because of the touring nature, the marketing system, like whatever it is, like you would have your favorite artist put out an album every 2 to 3 years. That wasn't the case back in the day. So it's not solely identifiable with this genre, but with
Hmm.
the requirements that go into composition, orchestration, recording of all of this, you would think maybe you'd have an off year. But like there were times when Yes was putting out 2 albums a year. I mean, that's
Well,
insane.
Yes was just yeah, they're just
Crazy. Yeah.
nuts.
Yeah.
Um, you
But
know,
they
there
were all
were,
doing that. Genesis was putting out multiple. I mean, every year from 69 to 76, you had a Genesis album. There were 8
yeah,
albums. It's
yeah.
crazy.
And it's kind of, so if it's funny if you look at it, so you know, most of these bands, um, you can put Jethro Tull and King Crimson in there. Yes, you mentioned Genesis.
Hmm.
We
Emerson,
talked
Lake
about
and
Emerson,
Palmer.
Lake and Palmer earlier. Um, it's like all of these bands had their debut album come out between like 68 and 70.
Yeah.
It was very like, there was very little of this going on, and then an absolute explosion of prog rock.
Yeah.
And like you mentioned, these bands that got popular, like this early first wave of progressive rock, it was enormous and immensely popular, and they didn't stop. The ones that got on that wave early, there's so many albums coming out so close to each other, and
Yeah.
they just, you know, they ran with the formula. And um you know, these are some of the best rock musicians, um in history, in recorded history. It's amazing to listen to what they're doing on these early albums, and it could be like, you know, 68, 69, and it's it sounds so, still to me, a lot of it sounds so fresh and interesting.
Hmm.
And you know, we weren't alive in the late 60s, early 70s to be part of that movement when it hit, but you know, a lot of the guitar tones rival some of the guitar tones in, you know, hard rock music to this very day. The recording techniques, you know, a lot of these albums just sound, from a production standpoint, very crisp and clear, and you can hear every aspect of what they're doing, because that's an important part of the picture that they're trying to paint. You can hear every single note, every single, tap of the drumstick on the edge of a cymbal to a small flourish on an organ or a keyboard to some other instrument, whether it's a flute in a Jethro Tull song or strings in an Electric Light Orchestra song. Every single aspect of that recording is easily heard and understood what it is and how it sits in the mix, and what part that plays in the song,
Right.
which is incredibly impressive for that time period. um so all of that comes together in this art form that is in its absolute infancy.
Yeah.
And where it's almost like it's easy to see how at that time, um it was like just hugely popular. It
Hmm.
was so huge. um and it really just opened the floodgates of experimentation for so many bands. And that foundation was already laid, and they're kind of building these structures. And you get groups like Rush that come in the later 70s to
Hmm.
carry the torch on from there. But it starts to kind of splinter off a little bit. You could argue that some of those earlier groups have a lot of similarities in how they sound.
Yeah.
um a lot of them have, or the orchestral, little bit of a like medieval theme going. There's somewhat of a minstrel-esque quality to a lot of it.
Hmm.
And but things start to get a little bit more, as interesting as it is, start to get a little bit more interesting as we move forward.
Yeah. I see it as it almost burned itself out too quickly too. I think
Oh
that
yeah.
the form that it took, and I think that Emerson, Lake and Palmer, Robert Fripp, and the iterations of King Crimson, like
Hmm.
those are sort of standing at the epicenter of, again, like the word pretension comes to mind. I think that that's unfair. I think that it is just harder to it's a little more inaccessible or selectively accessible. I think that to see some of this music live, or to
Hmm.
be at a place where you can appreciate this music, there's something really special to it. But I don't think that it was ever set for success. Not
Mm.
that music as an art form needs to be, right. So that I
Right.
think it existed in its purest sense, burned, and then the ashes kind of scattered and created all this other stuff, which is great.
Hmm.
But you look at David Byrne coming out of that era. You look at, I mean, Bowie. Like, I don't know. It's easier to typify a group um, as a prog group, so to speak. But when you look at Bowie, like,
Well,
he's
how can you
pretty.
define Bowie?
Yeah, that's the thing. Like, he's pretty prog, but like, were the Velvet Underground, like they were art rock, like
Yeah, art rock is kind of
Roxy
its own thing.
Roxy Music
Roxy
was
Music.
proggy but had a punk glam thing to it, right? So
Yeah.
there was a lot of different things going on, and I think some of them were more malleable
For sure.
because you didn't have this threshold that you had to meet of the ability to orchestrate, the ability to play the piano or the keys, or to do this thing at
Or
this
the oboe.
elevated level. Yeah, or the oboe. Like I think it prevented it from evolving beyond in its own space. But I do think,
Hmm.
like you're teasing here, like I think that it definitely meant that it would go on to influence a ton of people. I also think, though, that you have to mention the fact that there is this backlash against it. I want to say immediately, but we're talking almost 10 years later ultimately, but you get to
Mhm.
the end of the 70s and punk is almost in its core flying in the face of what prog did,
Yeah.
because it is just saying, no, I'm going to play three chords and you're going to listen to me,
Yeah.
like that's
Exactly.
I'm undeniable and you're not better than me. And like,
For sure.
like, yeah,
Well,
it's
yeah,
like,
and
go ahead.
anytime that there is uh a subset or a subculture or whatever that gets to be as insanely popular as prog rock did, there's
Mhm.
going to be a counterculture movement against
Right.
it. It's just it's cyclical. It's just how human nature is.
But it's
You're
hard.
going to eventually have that happen.
It's hard to then try to define rock, like, is prog rock almost like in opposition to what you would think of as rock? Rock is gritty, rock is raw, but it doesn't have to be. It does kind of make me think of the versatility of this quote unquote word rock music, or words
Yeah,
like it doesn't need to be one thing or the other. It has an expansive flexibility to it. But
definitely.
the rawness of it was completely stripped away, wasn't allowed for, and it left this kind of gaping hole. It also, I mean, prog musicians were like nerdy art kids,
Yeah.
like they were like classically
Yes.
trained, like, like, it's funny whenever I think we've touched on this before, and I think I'll keep coming back to it because it applies almost everywhere. When you think of Kiss, when you think of Ozzy Osbourne, when you think of Alice Cooper, when you think of
Hmm.
the most like badass rock stars, they're not. They're just nerds. They're
Oh
like,
yeah.
you only
No, they're
really
D
get
and D
into
nerds.
that. Yeah, you only get into that unless you're like a blue collar kid who's looking to get out of his town, or you're a D&D nerd who listened to his brother's or his cousin's records,
Hmm.
and was exposed to the Clash. Like, every rock star is really a nerd. It's the reason why they became a rock star, so that they wouldn't feel
Totally.
like a nerd anymore. But like,
Exactly.
the Prague kids kind of embraced it. They were like,
Oh yes.
they
They
flew the
went with
flag.
it. Hmm.
Yeah. Like, and so I feel like that also spurs this glamness. Like, start seeing the glam movement come out of that, because it's kind of
Hmm.
like, oh no, we are not going to have the bushy beards and the white t-shirts or whatever. Like, we're going to be flashy rock stars. We're going to bring it back to this kind of desirable swagger thing
Yeah.
that didn't exist there. Um,
Hmm.
so yeah, so we get through the 70s. um the whole thing kind of starts to shift, and dude, the 80s changed everything too. Like,
Right.
it's not fair to just be like the 80s killed prog, because the
No.
80s just shifted everything. I mean, you look at what blues rock had to go through. We've talked about ZZ
Oh
Top,
yeah.
right? Aerosmith becomes this glam band. Like, blues rock had its own sort of paradigm shift to
Right.
accommodate the 80s. Everybody was accommodating the 80s.
Yeah.
Um,
Yes.
and some come out like with their defining moments. I mean, like,
Yeah.
Supertramp has these hits. Genesis, I mean, the Phil Collins era of Genesis is the one that most people know if you
Right.
walk
That's
down the
what
street
they're
and ask
known
them.
for. And the
Exactly.
same can be said for, bands that you could still put in that progressive category, like, Styx or
Hmm.
Kansas, bands like that. Like I mentioned earlier, ELO was putting out records into the 80s, well into the 80s. They never really stopped, but um, it was just a different um set of rules, so to speak, that they had to play by, that
Yeah.
so that they could still retain their, call it arena rock or whatever you want to call it, um, aspects of the progressive rock ethos were still there, but to bring it forward into the 80s with the different demands that fans had
Hmm.
and the changing times, it just had to change,
Yeah.
like all things do. So it changed in a few different directions. You mentioned the glam rock thing, um, and there's the whole arena rock to a certain aspect, may have influenced hair metal to a certain extent.
Hmm.
There's virtuosity there, um, and there's the whole birth of this subgenre of progressive metal,
Oh yeah.
that was never really something that I um, understood or got into very much, at least not at the time that it was popular. But that really got started in the early 80s, with all of this shift towards, the 80s was all about extremes, right?
Hmm.
That kind of defines the 80s as like, okay, you like you like this color, well, we're gonna make it neon and day glow. You know what I mean? It's like, oh, you like drugs, we're gonna create these drugs that will kill you.
Yeah.
The 80s was just extreme,
Yeah.
and that's just one of the things that is so, that's just the signature stamp of the 80s. So
Yeah.
these groups, whether it was, um you know Sticks with their just massive sound and use of keyboards and technology to create these off the wall ridiculous sounds and fill arenas with
Hmm.
it, or the progressive metal
Kansas. Yeah.
bands
Oh
that
yeah.
would um, take what rock music and that early hard rock and that early metal did, and just like, put it on a bullet train to heck. It's like they you had to go extreme to be noticed or to
Yeah.
stay relevant.
Yeah.
And
And I
so
think
that's one of the things that moved it forward quite a bit, and it was the only way to get through the 80s at that point.
yeah, and you had some bands. So I feel like Rush is the band that were kind of able to sustain and curate their progness,
They did.
and really kind of bridge the gap between what prog was in the 70s, like we're talking about, and where it went, which was into hard rock. I mean,
Mhm.
they were one of the bands, and they were the banner leader of these bands that kind of transitioned that next generation into appreciating hard rock in an experimental, virtuoso leaning space. A lot of unique orchestrations, just hyper talented
Mhm.
musicianship, but with an aggression that you didn't see in the earlier 70s. And then with a lot of synth in the 80s. And I
Yeah.
think you're right. I think then you just see the appreciation of this kind of style of a 7 to 8 minute long song that's orchestrated, that's telling a story, is embraced by metal, and it's embraced by
Right.
hard rock, and it's kind of shunned by everybody else. All the other genres want a quick shot, a palatable pop song. They're going back into this space, and everything ebbs and
Exactly.
flows, obviously.
Yeah. Because you
But
either go
they
that direction that metal did, or you go "Owner of a Lonely Heart" by
right,
Yes, which is like,
right,
that's not a Yes song. Come on,
right. But it's the
guys.
Yes song that most people know, right? Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah. So I think that there's something to be said about how it did actually survive, you know, like
Yes.
it's still in existence today. If you go to a metal concert, you see these guys that just play incredible
Incredible.
uh guitar solos and drum solos and stuff, and it's not,
Perfect syncopation, just
yeah,
like
it's not
crazy.
improvised. Like, so, like
No,
obviously generalizing, some bands
generally
do it,
not.
but like for the most part, it is calculated, like, you know, high level textbook
Yes.
execution that's happening. So it's really cool. You obviously, what you got is these kids who were listening to this music, or their brothers' LPs, and then
Hmm.
they're interpreting it themselves. Um, you also have this, and I know we delve into this space from time to time because of the nature of our podcast, but like, you also have, speaking of technology
Hmm.
and its abilities, you have game composers that
Yeah.
are also delving into this. They're experiencing this as they're growing up, and then they want to be musicians and composers themselves, but they find themselves doing it in the tech space.
Yes.
And you think of some of the biggest kind of uh, progenitors of game composition, game music composition,
Hmm.
Koji Kondo, who did all the great Zelda music, was a massive Emerson, Lake and Palmer fan, a
Yep.
huge Deep Purple fan. He was in a cover band that played that
Oh
music, you
wow, I
know?
didn't even know
Yeah,
that.
it's
That's
crazy,
awesome.
right? Nobuo Utsumatsu, who did all of the great Final Fantasy stuff. So
Yeah.
I'm playing. I've never played Final Fantasy VI before. I'm about. I think I'm two
Really?
thirds. I'm 2/3 of the way through it.
Wow.
I think I'm loving it. And as we were getting ready for this episode, and I'm playing through it on my Game Boy, and I'm like, my God, like, this is prog music. Like the battle
It pretty
stuff that
much
I'm going
is.
into,
Yeah.
it feels like it. And then I do a quick Google, and not only is he on record as a massive King Crimson and Genesis fan and Emerson, Lake and Palmer fan, but
Hmm.
he also has been in a cover band called the Black Mages, where they're
Yes.
basically like a prog rock cover band where they do some originals but just do Final Fantasy covers, and they perform.
Right.
They have 3 albums, you know.
It's
um
amazing. And you
but
could
it's,
call that progressive metal. And
yeah.
a lot of that early video game music, I mean, like Mega Man 2 comes to
Hmm.
mind. Like when you hear these compositions played with like distorted guitar and drums, you're like, oh, this is metal.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
they were creating a heavy metal soundtrack
They just couldn't
to
do it
this.
with, yeah, with the
Exactly.
few sound channels they had or whatever. Yeah,
Exactly right.
yeah.
And so it certainly stands to reason that these composers using 8-bit, what sounds like just blips and bleeps, uh they had to be inspired by something. And that at the time, this is the late 80s, the renaissance of gaming. And this is when you have, you mentioned King Crimson, but you've got bands coming up like Queensryche and Dream Theater, and
Hmm.
these, and again, a lot of these, a lot of these, Iron Maiden, and a lot of these bands. Yet again, they're coming from across the pond.
Yeah,
These are British groups primarily.
yeah,
Um, so, and then you've got stuff like black metal coming also from Europe. So that's where a lot of this is coming from.
yeah.
And you see that through, they basically carry the torch of progressive rock music through almost the entirety of the 90s.
Yeah, I mean, Radiohead, and again, it's a dirty word. You know, they're on record as being like, when they released OK Computer, a reporter asked them, like, in listening to it, oh, you guys must have been influenced by early Genesis, Pink Floyd, and they were just like, oh no, we all hate prog rock. Like they, because again, like, I think it's more the idea of prog rock and not what actually influenced them. I mean,
Right.
the lead song was like 6 or 7 minutes long or something. I mean, come on, guys. You're
Yeah.
all British art school students. I
Yeah,
like,
and that may be the thing because even Radiohead as a name came from a Talking Heads song.
I mean, come
So
on.
they're more of the art school ilk
Yeah.
and the art rock type thing,
So
which you could
they'll
tell more
define
on their
themselves.
earlier
Yeah.
stuff before they
Yeah.
started to evolve. But there's an argument for them being progressive rock. I mean,
Oh yeah.
it has to be. There's always some
Yeah.
bleed over anyway, but um, you know that what else do you call progressive rock in the late 90s if you're not talking about like the heavier stuff?
Well, yeah, I mean, so for Shanti, obviously Red Hot Chili Peppers are not a prog rock band, but for Shanti has cited Adrian Belew, who was in sort of King Crimson 2.0 and played with Zappa and Talking Heads,
Hmm.
like for Shanti, Tom Morello of Rage, in that experimental, more aggressive state of
Right.
rock, have cited back to this prog rock space. I feel like Muse comes to mind. Like
Yeah,
they're a band that just
you have to.
they have this kind of expansive orchestration to a lot of their music. Coheed and Cambria is one to me. Like they have movements and a story. I mean, all of
Oh,
their
for
albums
sure.
are part of a story arc,
Right.
Um,
They're
and
definitely prog rock, 100%.
yeah, them, and we talked about Mars Volta too. I mean, those guys, and Mars Volta, Omar has done a lot with Frusciante as well.
Yeah.
There's this kind of collaborative. Again, I feel like it prevents it from being as expansive, like continues to be, because you have these enlightened people or these people who just have the chops, and so they
Hmm.
all start working together and creating this amazing artistic music that is then you put it out there and it's tough to digest for
It's
the
hard to
common folk. Like
digest.
I
Right.
listen to some of it and I'm like, what is this noise? I don't know. I don't think I can
Yes.
listen to this. Yeah. Yeah.
But I mean, you know what? People said the same thing about albums like John Coltrane's out, his more free-form jazz albums
Hmm.
in the 60s, because it's like, at first listen, I remember putting it on. I was listening to Interstellar Space and I was listening to it a lot back in like, early 2000s
And
in
so were these
college years.
artists, by the way, though.
Yeah,
Like,
for sure.
yeah.
And like I put it on for, I think honestly I put it on for my brother and he was like, how can you listen to this? This
Yeah.
sounds like a bunch of random noise. And I was like, no, you don't understand. It's not random noise at all. It's like there's movements and patterns that are there.
Yeah.
And it's made evident by the fact that, the one of the reasons why I got into John Coltrane's Interstellar Space at that time to begin with is because Nels Cline was one of my favorite guitar players, and he put out an album covering the entirety of Interstellar Space by John Coltrane.
Oh, wow.
Him and a drummer named Greg Bendian. And it was just mind blowing to me. And I remember my brother just listening. Like he was we were driving somewhere in the car, and he was just like, "What this literally sounds like just absolute noise. Like there's nothing here to appreciate or glean anything from." And it's funny because you look a lot of these, whatever you want to call it, new prog or neo progressive rock, and you've got bands like Lightning Bolt. You could even throw in what might be categorized as like Japanese noise rock with bands like Melt Banana, and when they play the song, it sounds the same every time that they play it. Like
Hmm.
they know what they're doing, and they're playing what they're playing on purpose. They're not just randomly like making noise with their guitar that they're not planning on uh repeating or being able to replicate at some point.
Right.
But as the term progressive implies, it's pushing the boundaries of what rock music can be, of what it is. It's not just, you know, play a 18-minute song with a few different solos and some key changes and some tempo changes anymore. It's something else now. And it can still be what it was back then, but there's new definitions now. And so whether it's, bands like Lightning Bolt or Hella or um Mars Volta, there's so much that you can do as a rock musician, that almost an infinite amount of combinations of tone, melody, uh sonic differences. It's you could never reach the end of what's possible.
Yeah.
And there are bands that just continue to push that boundary of what is rock music, what is it. They just push it out. It could be anything.
Feel like part of this also is just like I've never really been to see any artist that you would qualify as like a prog artist, or like the real banner carrier for prog. I had a buddy who had an extra ticket to see Tool. They had like rescheduled their tour dates, and he was asking me if I wanted to go, and they were expensive tickets. Like, it wasn't a freebie.
Yeah.
And a Tool is one, and it's funny because their discography is not deep. I mean, the albums are long, I know, but like I think they've only got like 4 albums.
They don't put albums very often, that's for sure.
No, I mean, like, he's gone off. Maynard's done like a Perfect Circle stuff and puts it for a few other things, but he's Tool. It seems like a manageable body of work where someone could go in and just catch up, and get into the mix and not have to worry about 15 albums worth of material.
Right.
But like, I've dipped my toe a few times, admittedly, and I just can't get there. And there's a part of me that thinks like maybe if I went and experienced it in person, because it's obviously that curated thing, it's obviously built for with a vision. Maybe if I had seen it live, I just didn't want to roll the dice with like a $250 ticket, but like I maybe if I saw it live, I'd walk away and be like, okay, now I can go dig into this music because I kind of get what he's doing. But
it hasn't worked for you with Fish, has it?
It has not. But Fish is not. See, but I think Fish is in that psych space, and I don't think they want to be considered a psych band or prog band for that matter. But my stuff for Fish is like, because I've seen it. I mean, I've seen the balloons outside of the venue. People go there, they get high, and they have their own experience to the music, and
it's a personal
great
experience.
for them. Yeah, good for them. But that is also completely based on improvisation, whereas I know that a Tool show, you're going to get the Tool show. Like, I don't think they're changing the set list or whatever that much. Like, you're getting the experience that Maynard has created for you. I just don't know if I want that. Like,
it's not for everybody.
But they are, if we're talking in the prog space of like what I look at in general, and I'm like, I wish I understood. I feel like I want to understand better. Like, I think I've got Rush. I understand it. I don't think I need to spend much time with it. I got it. It's cool.
Not my thing either.
It's not my thing. Yeah.
But you're right about the prog thing with like, if you go to a Mars Volta show, you're going to get the Mars Volta more or less how it sounds on the album.
Curated. Yeah.
Very curated, very precise.
Because the visuals will be dialed in there too, like it's not just going to be like a lighting guy who's doing a bunch of stuff. It's going to be a presentation.
No, that's well calculated.
Yeah.
And that's what we get math rock from. And here's where it comes full circle: is you get these math rock groups like Battles. I don't know how much they're a New York band, so I don't know if you know much about them. But they had their moment like with their first album. But the thing about Battles is their music is based around loops, where they'll play an instrument and loop that instrument and then play on top of that loop and have these intersecting loops,
Killer.
which takes very
Yeah.
just
You have to
insane.
know what you're
It
doing.
blows my mind the amount of precision that takes,
Hmm.
because
Preparation.
you've got multiple layers of loops happening and multiple. Well, now they're down to 2 people, but back when they were 4 people and then 3 people and now 2, the more people you have, obviously, and maybe that's why it didn't last so long, because I can see how stressful that would be when you've got 4 different people playing loops and all having
Hmm.
to make sure that all of these things line up. But they had John Anderson of Yes
Yeah.
on their most recent album.
Oh, wow.
So it's pretty cool to see that, it's just a nod back to, the roots of what they're doing. I thought that was really cool. Um, so I'm seeing it come full circle where, Yes and Battles sound nothing alike,
Hmm.
different philosophies behind what they're doing, but Yes is still out there putting out albums. Battles is still touring, and they have a song where John Anderson comes in and does a vocal on this crazy looping math rock song, and it works. It works really really well. So I'd be interested to see more, like, more modern uh math rock and, experimental new prog or whatever you want to call it, and bring in some of these, absolute giants of the prog rock genre and work together on projects and see what happens. I think it'd
Yeah.
be cool.
Well, cool. I think the only other thought that I had, just taking it away from the rock space where we spent most of this time, obviously that's where this existed, is like, you know, it doesn't fully track. I'll give it that, but there is a lot to hip hop that is um, sort of ebbing and flowing or coming in waves akin to what naturally happened to rock over the years.
Right.
And I'm kind of looking for that now. And in some ways it may already be happening with Kendrick Lamar and Thundercat and Flying Lotus and all these other, like, there's a lot of really cool experimentation in hip hop right now.
Hmm.
But there is a part of me that thinks, okay, I obviously wasn't born when this happened to rock, right?
Right.
But am I missing it now happening elsewhere? And it does kind of, it's exciting, but it also like opens my ears to listening for different things, because just because um, this happened and
Hmm.
it kind of shattered and scattered, like it could be happening again in other ways. There's a lot of jazz influence. There's a lot of
Right.
electronic influences that are happening in hip hop right now. So just putting it out there in general as like a final thought is like,
Yeah.
this is the trajectory that, so to speak, rock took. But there's so much other kinds of music, and they all have their own sort of peaks and valleys and shifts
Hmm.
between commercialism and experimentation, just as the audiences shift. And I think that there's a lot of cool stuff out there as well. So
Yeah. I mean, I might be
ears
behind the
open.
times. I certainly don't have my finger on the pulse of hip hop or anything. I think you saw it a lot with Outkast.
Oh
And
yeah.
I think, I think that flows into what we've been seeing these last few years with, like, Run the Jewels,
Hmm.
where, they're not like the most well known, but people that know about music and love music, they're very popular.
Right.
And they do some really interesting and experimental stuff.
Yeah.
So I'm sure there's new and upcoming artists that you and I probably have no idea about, that are going to be the next, you know what I mean, what Outcast was, and
Hmm.
um what Run the Jewels have been, um to, and Kendrick is certainly going to be considered a part of that.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, you're right. It's exciting to see um, what other genres end up branching off with and being considered progressive in one way or
Yeah.
another.
Yeah.
And sometimes, you won't know what it is until it happened 5 or 10 years ago.
Yeah.
So, sometimes it works that way.
We
Go
had a
ahead.
few comments
Yeah,
from our community, right?
exactly where I was going to go.
Nice.
So we just put a quick little community question out there. I just thought it'd be interesting just because so many people have different um, definitions of prog rock. Um, and so our good friend Seth from the All In podcast took it as an opportunity to talk about Dragon Force. Now, I knew almost nothing about Dragon Force
Hmm.
before his comment, which was only, not even 12 hours ago,
Hmm.
as of this recording. So, do you have any history with them, or because all I did was I put it on in the car, and like I felt like I was about to face a giant mech in a boss battle.
I mean, that's the point. That's the whole point. I a little bit. They came to prominence in the sort of mid to late 2000s, like 2000, 2010, whatever we're calling it, the aughts, I guess. And all I could remember is just the guitar player is out of control.
Mhm.
It's so crazy. I remember playing one of their songs in Guitar Hero and being like, who is this band, and digging up one of their albums and just being absolutely blown away by the musicality, again specifically of the guitarist, but just
Mhm.
yeah, they shred your face off.
They should, yeah, it's a
Yeah.
shredder for sure.
But it's epic.
Um, yes, that's a good word for it. Seth says they have clear Dream Theater and Rush influences, and he's seen them a handful of times. Um, this isn't what's interesting. He says he's seen them in loud mosh pit venues like Ozfest or something, but I've also seen them in almost orchestral theater settings. I once saw them at the Wilma when we lived in Montana, and you could hear a pin drop in there. It was incredible. Top 5
Wow.
shows I've ever been to. Despite how heavy they can be, they have such a symphonic sound.
Hmm.
And I think that too is, we were talking about the video game music earlier. Is it's like, okay, you could play this with an orchestra, or you could
Yeah,
play it with, shredding guitar, and it's equally epic in different ways.
the composition holds, right? It's like
Yes.
you can express it in different ways, you can orchestrate it in different ways, but the actual composition itself can be transferred to many different formats.
Yeah, definitely. Dan talks about having vivid memories of playing Smash Brothers Melee with friends and having Dream Theater blasting in the background.
I love that. I
It
love
seems
that so much.
very appropriate.
That seems perfect. I also feel like I should be playing video games with Dragon Force in the background. I
Absolutely.
I was in my new metal phase when I was curating my Nintendo 64 gaming, and so I listened to a lot of Rob Zombie and Power Man 5000 when I was gaming. So not as progressive as Dan is with his Dream Theater. I feel like he's a little more elevated than me, but I can feel that. Like dude, I loved playing video games with music on in the
Yeah,
background. It was my jam for a while. And then I was like,
absolutely.
oh no, these games actually have really good music. I should probably be listening to those.
I definitely did the same thing for
Yeah.
sure. I heard there was a lot of like heavy rock, hard rock being played while I played Sonic 3 and Sonic and
Yeah.
Knuckles for sure. Which yeah, but you're right, you're missing out on some of these amazing soundtracks that were,
Especially Sonic
as we talked
3.
about, very
Yeah.
very much influenced by a lot of these groups that we talked about. And the last thing on SAZ on Twitter uh, talks about Blue Oyster Cult, which we didn't really get a chance to talk about, but they're another one of those groups that very much fit into that prog rock space, but found a little bit more success on the poppier side of things, at least,
Hmm.
later on. Um, he says, one of my fondest memories with my dad is pounding Budweisers on the farm late into the night and pumping their debut Agents of Fortune and Tyranny and Mutation, among other stuff. I love that, having that, like, that moment with your dad or
Yeah.
whoever it is, like, or with like me with my aunt listening to Moody Blues or what have you. That those are so memorable. And it's like every time that, I'm sure every time SA hears Blue Oyster Cult, he thinks about his dad. And,
Mm-hmm.
like me, every time I listen to Moody Blues or I hear some Moody Blues somewhere, I think about my aunt and the time that we spent together. So it can be really beautiful. And, I'm sure that applies to any genre of music, but I don't know. There is just something special about it because it's the kind of music that you do just kind of sit and become very introspective and thoughtful about, rather than it just being background music or something that's playing in the car while you're on your way to go do something else.
Yeah, it's not as frequent that you hear a great pop song and you're like, "Oh my god, you need to sit and listen to this." Sometimes, you'll say, "Oh my god, have you heard that new song by Harry Styles? It's really great." But there's a reason why it's these sorts of artists, or the artists that are falling under this umbrella, that have these kind of nostalgia points to them. It's because when you feel connected, like, they do bring you into the circle. If you can feel connected to this music, you want to share that connection with other people. You're like, "Oh
100%.
my god, I've seen this, I've experienced this, I feel this, I understand this. Don't you want to as well?"
Yes.
So I totally get that. Yeah,
I've had those moments too, where
that's how
you
I
sit somebody
discovered the
down.
Mars Volta. Yeah,
There you go. Yeah,
yeah.
you
Like,
have to
somebody
sit
was
down
like,
and
"Here you
listen.
go." Yeah, someone was
You
like, "You
can't
need
get
to
it
listen
any
to
other
this."
way.
Yeah,
100%.
yeah,
Oh man. I think that pretty well wraps us up here
yeah. I mean, it's a
on this
lot.
episode.
Yeah,
And again, like I mentioned at the beginning, I know we're gonna get comments.
yeah.
You
We're
didn't
not
even talk about
experts.
so and so, or
Yeah,
you didn't mention this thing that happened. Or it's like, first of all, we're in a limited time format, but
hmm,
also we never claimed to be we never claimed to be experts. We just like talking about this stuff and exploring this stuff and learning things about it. If
yeah,
you would like to school us in any of this stuff, not only are we happy to be schooled, but we will retweet it and we can talk about it on the next episode. You can hit us up on Twitter at retrogroove_pod if you'd like to tell us who exactly we didn't mention that we should have.
It's
Or
probably Marillion, by the way. Like, I didn't bring up Marillion at all, and they have like the craziest online. Like, they are the most like kickstarted prog rock band of the
really,
past like 30. Yeah, they were doing like
wow.
fan sourced stuff on the internet like 20 something years ago. So it's probably, we're going to wind up on a Marillion subreddit or something.
Oh,
So
man.
sorry Marillion. Yeah, your guys
Well,
are
now
great.
I have something new to check out and listen to because I've never
There you go.
even heard of
It's
Marillion.
Marillion.
Sorry, Marillion. Man, just pissed off all of the Marillion fans on planet
Yeah,
Earth
there's
with
a lot
one
of them.
episode of Retro Groove. But any closing thoughts, Liam, or we pretty much
No, I think that
nailed
felt
it
good.
down?
Yeah,
Yeah, I liked having this discussion with you. It was good stuff.
same.
First time that we've ever attempted to tackle an entire subgenre in one sitting. And maybe we'll try it again. I think
Yeah.
it was a pretty good way to hash out a lot of thoughts about a lot of different things, all in the span of an hour and a half. And I had a lot of fun. I hope you listener did too. Thank you so much for listening to Retro Groove. We're part of the Retro Logic family of podcasts. You can find us on Discord on the Retro Logic server. And as I mentioned just a moment ago, you can also find us on Twitter at retrogroove_pod. Looking forward to hearing from you. We'll do community questions. Always appreciate feedback, ideas, and just the friendly discourse and discussion. But until next time, thank you so much, and we'll see you later.